Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Hello, and welcome to this evening's program. I'm Mary Jane Daly, current president of AMITA, the Association of MIT Alumni, and an urban planning graduate alum. I'm also a lecturer and professional development director in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. The MIT Women's Association was founded in 1899 with Ellen Swallow Richards, MIT's first woman student, graduate, and instructor, as its first president. Since 1899, more than 20 years before women would win the right to vote, AMITA has been a supportive presence for MIT women in a variety of ways, including through the recent creation of a pay equity task force, which I co-chair with alumna Kristen Smith, 04. This effort grew out of a conversation with Clinton Blackburn, 08, and Kristen at an alum event in San Francisco at the end of January, and centered on shared and timely concerns about gender pay equity. The task force's efforts to serve as a resource for alum and students thus far includes a record of a listening tour on the topic of pay equity with national thought leaders, as well as the beginning of an online FAQ. Please check out the pay equity section of our new website, and be sure to take advantage of our anniversary offer of free AMITA membership. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by AMITA and MIT's Equal Pay Working Group, which I co-lead with Dr. Deborah Liverman, the Executive Director of Career Advising and Professional Development at MIT, to whom I'll hand the mic now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane, and thank you all for being here. Career Advising and Professional Development is happy to join with AMITA to bring this program together for our students, undergrad, grad students, and postdocs. I would like to give you some history about how we got started with our Equal Pay Working Group. MIT, in general, collects outcome information for all of its graduates, and we have collected information by demographics since 2010. However, it wasn't until recently, in 2017, when one of our data interns, who's now one of my colleagues, Sue Acton, chose to take a deep dive into the data and to look at gender pay. We presented those results at a conference in the spring to our employers, and from there, I would say our efforts launched. Later, I was introduced to organizers of the Equal Pay Initiative in the New York area and participated in a panel for Inclusion by Design Equal Pay Day. At that conference, I heard one of our panelists tonight, Siri, who was featured as the keynote speaker and talked about equal pay research. I brought Siri to the MIT community in the summer of 2019 so that others can also hear what she had to say. As we continue on, gender pay became part of a faculty-led career exploration report led by Dave Darmerfall, and then most recently this summer, Mary Jane and I got together and said, we must move forward. So we brought our partners together for the Equal Pay Working Group, and that consists of Career Advising and Professional Development, AMITA, MIT UPOP, SWE, GWAMET, Women and Gender Studies, Sloan Career Development Office, MIT School of Engineering Communications Lab, Sloan Women, and we are supported by MIT Institutional Research. Our mission is to advocate for pay equity for MIT students and graduates from diverse backgrounds and experiences at the beginning and throughout their career. We're developing resources, programs, and education material on equal pay, so stay tuned. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Kristen Smith. Kristen is co-president of AMITA and is part of the Equal Pay Working Group, co-leading our education subgroup. Kristen graduated from MIT in 2004 with a degree in chemical engineering. Kristen is now an attorney in Palo Alto, California, and has received accolades of being listed as a 4-time Rising Star as published in the Northern California Super Lawyers. She sees her work with AMITA's Pay Equity Task Force, as well as the MIT Equal Pay Working Group, as being among the most rewarding volunteer work of her career so far. Kristen?
Thank you, Deborah. It's so great to have everyone here tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you for those introductory comments. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have our esteemed panelists here tonight. We will have our panelists review FAQs related to pay equity in 4 general areas, which our MIT students and alums, both women and members of historically marginalized groups, may encounter as they work to advance pay equity for all groups. First, we'll discuss FAQs related to the current state of pay inequity in the US. For these questions, we'll be speaking with Siri Chalazi, who is a research fellow at the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School and was also just introduced by Deborah. Next, we'll look at the underpinnings of the wage gap that we see for women and for members of historically marginalized groups, including a discussion of assessing that gap and what factors are stopping us from closing it. For this portion of the evening, we'll be speaking with Pam Kukos, who is the CEO and co-founder of Working Ideal, as well as a nationally recognized expert on pay equity and gender equity, as well as the factors that drive successful and unsuccessful responses to workplace discrimination. Pam also led the development of Department of Labor guidance on pay equity reviews. Joining Pam, we will also be speaking with Chaya Mandelbaum, who is chair of the California Fair Employment and Housing Council, as well as a partner with Rudy, Exelrod, Zieff, and Lowe in San Francisco. Chaya is participating tonight in his law firm capacity as an advocate for pay equity on behalf of employees. In addition to his work in private practice, Chaya was a trial attorney for the Office of the Solicitor at the United States Department of Labor. Once we have reviewed the factors related to pay equity assessment and analysis, we will be speaking with Elaine Lynn Herring, who is managing partner of Triad Consulting Group. Founded by members of the Harvard Negotiation Project, Triad helps individuals and organizations build capacity to have difficult conversations and work better together. Elaine will be speaking about questions related to ways of speaking up safely and effectively if and when it seems that something may be going wrong. The skills learned in Elaine's discussion can be applied broadly to speaking up on issues of pay equity, as well as issues related to bias and discrimination generally. Chaya will be joining in this portion of the conversation as well to address a question that comes up in nearly every scenario of this kind: at what point should I talk to a lawyer? Finally, we will talk with our panelists about steps that can be taken to move pay equity forward, as well as to reduce or eliminate bias. We'll be starting with comments from Chaya and perhaps Pam on potential legislation that can be used for this purpose. And we'll end by having each panelist give their recommendations in a lightning round format on immediate actions that companies can take in this regard. There is also a Q&A function that is enabled. If we have time, we will be opening up questions to our panelists. And if there's not time, we'll add these questions to the list of potential questions for the FAQ database that we're also currently developing through the work that we're doing at MIT. With that structure for our evening set out, let's begin by discussing the current state of pay inequity in the US. Siri, sometimes discussions about advancing pay equity efforts are derailed by participants asking whether or not a gender pay gap even exists. What is the current state of the gender pay gap in America between women and men, and how does that gender pay gap vary by race?
Based on the latest data, which is presently from 2018, the nationwide pay gap stands at 18 cents or 18%, meaning that women on average collectively in this country make about 82 cents to a white man's dollar. And as you mentioned, Kristen, that gap varies enormously by race. So for Asian American women, that number is actually 90 cents on a white man's dollar. For white women, 79 cents. For Black women, 62 cents. For Native American and Pacific Islander women, 57 cents. And sadly, the lowest paid group, so the group of women with the highest gender pay gap, that's Hispanic Latina women who are making on average 54 cents to a white man's dollar. So we have this huge range from 90 to 54 cents on a white man's dollar. And I should add that the gender pay gap varies not just by race and ethnicity, but also by other factors like location or state. States like Wyoming and Louisiana have a 30% wage gap, whereas California has only about a 12% gap. So enormous variation there. There's also variation by age. The pay gap tends to be smaller for younger age groups who are closer to college graduation, and it gets wider and wider the older you get.
Thank you so much. That's very, very unfortunate information, but that's so wonderful to kind of get that information out to our alums. What is the difference between pay gap and pay equity, and why is that important?
This question is incredibly important. The pay gap, that 82 cents on a dollar or 18% gap, it's a factual number that describes and illustrates the fact that women across this country are making less in earnings than men. And of course, by extension, you can imagine that they're also able to invest less money. Their Social Security checks are going to be smaller. Any income-dependent retirement benefits are going to be smaller. So it has huge lifetime implications. But that overall number, which we sometimes call the unadjusted pay gap, looks at everybody, regardless of industry, regardless of seniority, regardless of whether they're working full-time or part-time. So it's this big number that encompasses a lot of variation. And a lot of people would probably agree that, you know, if you work part-time versus full-time, it's not necessarily unfair that you make less money. If you're the most junior person in the organization, it's natural that you make less than the most senior person. So that is where the question of pay equity comes in. Pay equity is the question of, if we have two people who are identical in every other way except gender, do they make the same amount of money? Do they get equal pay for equal work? And sadly, even to this question, the answer is no. So what we refer to sometimes as the adjusted pay gap, or the pay gap that controls for things like education, amount of labor market experience, location, amount of hours worked. That pay gap is smaller than the 18 cents, the unadjusted gap. It shrinks to the single digits depending on which industry you look at, what type of workplace you look at, but it's still not zero. So we have a wage gap, and we also don't have pay equity in this country, sadly.
Excellent, thank you so much. Another response that our alumni may encounter when discussing pay equity is the assertion that women are just worse negotiators than men, and that's why they're paid less. What is the current state of research on negotiation outcomes for women versus men, and how do those comparisons differ when women negotiate on behalf of others rather than on behalf of themselves?
This narrative that the pay gap is somehow women's fault, and that if they only negotiated more adeptly that we could close that gap, is very persistent, but it's also wrong. There is a lot of research to suggest that women are hesitant, more hesitant than men, to negotiate their salary, and that when they do negotiate, they still get less than men. However, the other important side of that coin is that the reason women don't negotiate on their own behalf for things like salary is often that they accurately anticipate the social backlash that they would incur from negotiating. Societal stereotypes associate things like aggressive self-promotion more so with men than women. So those types of behaviors, being a brilliant negotiator and pushing for your own interests, those behaviors are acceptable from men, but we view them as much less acceptable from women. So when women display these types of behaviors and do things like negotiate very agentically on their own behalf, they incur a social penalty that's been well documented. And women implicitly know that penalty is coming, and so they take that into account and are much less likely to negotiate. But I do want to underscore, and this goes to the second part of your question, that when women do negotiate on behalf of other people, they actually do just as well as men. So this is not a question of women lacking negotiation skills. It's them choosing strategically and unconsciously in most cases about when and where to deploy those negotiation skills. And they are more likely to deploy those negotiation skills on other people's behalf as opposed to their own behalf.
Siri, thank you so much for this information. It will be invaluable in equipping our alums to help readily provide information and content related to the current status of pay inequity. And thank you for providing the article references, which I think we're following up after this event.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Wonderful, thank you. Pam, leaning into your vast expertise in this area, both in government and in private practice, why does the wage gap exist and what is stopping us from closing it?
Well, I'm going to build on two important points that Siri made. One is that there's existing inequality in the labor market and in the workplace, right? There's racism, there's gender stereotyping, there's inequality in access to getting into certain professions, there's occupational segregation. So all of those things are factors and are at play here, but it's also weaknesses within companies and organizations that tend to take those differences and in some cases magnify them or add on to those differences to impact particular people in the workplace, right? And so, for example, I like to say that it's easier to pay people the same than to pay people differently, but we work really hard at a lot of companies to pay people differently, right? To come up with very discretionary processes to say to hiring managers, do what you need to do to bring somebody on board without paying attention to how everybody else is already paid in the organization. To say that we think we have all these objective factors and that we're really paying people for performance, but you're probably not, because we're really, really bad at measuring that, right? And so those are gaps where bias can creep in, and there's not necessarily good accountability either to make sure, right, that those decisions are being made in a fair way, in an accountable way, in an objective way. And so I noticed Deborah mentioned there was a conference you had called Inclusion by Design. And in fact, it's these design factors and features of compensation programs that can have a really big impact on whether we are defaulting towards bias or defaulting towards more equitable solutions and approaches. And we don't do enough either to help hiring managers and to help the people that are on the front lines of having to decide how to make a salary offer to someone, or whether there should be an increase with the tools that they need to do that fairly and effectively, right? So we treat it as a one-off decision about this one person as opposed to an organizational process, right? And we also don't think enough about how culture is inside our organizations and in general is affecting these decisions. So you take all that, you layer it on top of the existing problems of inequality, and then you end up paying people differently who really should be paid comparably. So the weakness in practice, the lack of good procedures and support, and the existing underlying inequality are all important reasons we haven't solved this. And while the first one is really tough, we really do have ways to address the other two.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful, thank you. So companies have access to, of course, all of their own data. How should companies and organizations analyze their pay data for equity?
So I like to think about this as due diligence, right? As really understanding risk and going looking for trouble, right? And one of the weaknesses in organizational practice is that these internal evaluations tend to be overly narrow, tend to be looking at only one kind of risk, right? So are we going to get sued by this person? And because there's always lots of reasons why you can try to justify or excuse a decision that got made, there isn't necessarily the pressure to go in and really understand what's happening. But you also have risk, reputational risk. Stakeholders and investors are very interested in this. And you also have the risk that you're actually doing a bad job of paying people, right? So I like to think if there is a race or gender pay gap, it's often because there's a process that isn't really working right to deliver compensation based on what you value and what you want to reward. And so you're probably overcompensating some folks as well as undercompensating them. And so thinking more strategically about how you're making those decisions will not only help you address your pay equity issues, perhaps prevent legal problems, is the right ethical thing to do, but it also can make your pay programs operate better, right? So, and it can also keep you from losing the diverse talent that you have worked hard to get, into your organization if you're not paying people fairly and consistently. So those are a lot of risks that don't always get factored in, and it causes organizations to look very narrowly, to look, I think, Siri framed this up as, are people identical? But we also want to know what's happening for folks at different levels of the organization. There might not be within job pay equity, but maybe there's stratification, and maybe there's people who are not getting the same kinds of economic opportunities, and that's impacting equity in your organization too. We know at least anecdotally that a lot of times the glass ceiling lines right up with where the major bonus structure is, where equity and stock options can attach. And so you want to really look at the full story of your organization and what's happening in order to identify risk and improve equity in the workplace. So you want to look across occupations and levels as well as within them, and you don't want to be so narrowly focused on exactly the same person, same job, that you can only compare like 3 people out of 100, right? That's not going to give you very good and useful information about your compensation program overall.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Your answer reminds me to let the audience know that we have a wonderful and a pretty thorough interview with you that's been posted on our Pay Equity Task Force webpage. And so anyone who's more interested in this very interesting information can look at that as well. And thank you for that. So another question, what does pay transparency mean and why is it important? So
pay transparency is a concept, right, that compensation should be apparent, transparent, and accountable to the workers inside an organization, right? Historically, there have been a lot of practices around pay secrecy. Companies have had policies that you're not supposed to talk about it, you're not allowed to talk about it. Those have actually been illegal for a very, very long time, but people still don't know that. I still have to have conversations with my clients where they want to say, well, can I just ask them nicely not to talk about it? No, you can't do that either. The way the culture is moving, the way younger workforce is thinking about these issues, the way technology is moving, it doesn't matter, right? Transparency is here, and we need to embrace it, and we need to figure out how to leverage that to get the kind of system that we want, right? So we know that more and better information and transparency promotes accountability, which is one of the best levers to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in the workforce. We have really good research on this, right? So people are paying attention, they can hold you to account. Now, there's lots of kinds of transparency. So some companies have 100%, everything is on the table, everybody knows everybody's salary. But you can promote transparency short of that and still make a difference, right? So do you put pay ranges on your, when you're posting jobs, right? Do you give candidates the information they need? Because you've already decided how much you're going to pay somebody for this job, right? And you don't want people taking themselves out of the process too soon. Do people inside your organization understand the factors that might lead them to be able to get more money so that they do the work and deliver the value that you're actually hoping and encouraging them to do? If they don't actually understand how to make that connection, then you're not getting that benefit, right? And do folks understand that they can freely share and ask about salary, that is a perfectly normal thing, and there's nothing wrong with it? All of those practices are really important and can help both promote equity and also make sure you're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much. Those are great recommendations. This information will be very useful to our alums who have influence on these topics within their companies, some of whom you've already met, of course. Chaya, similar to Pam, you have a vast amount of experience, both from your work in government as well as extensive experience in private practice. Running through some common questions that come up on the employee side of this topic, employees may ask, how can I get the data to verify whether or not I'm being paid less than others?
Well, it's a great question. And as Pam mentioned, under federal law, you are allowed to discuss salary. You're allowed to ask your coworkers, you're allowed to share with your coworkers. and not just salary, but other aspects of compensation as well. So that's the main vehicle for employers or employees rather that work in workforces where there isn't uniform transparency or blanket transparency. And then state law supplements that. So I'm going to focus mostly on California because that's where I practice. But I do want to call the audience's attention to a great resource that's available through the U.S. Department of Labor's website, the Women's Bureau. And it's a very user-friendly pay equity and pay transparency map. So you can hover over your state and see state protections. In California, we have a number of additional protections. Most notably, after a recent amendment, you can also ask an employer for the salary band or salary range for the position that you have, so you can get some sense, even if your coworkers and you are not sharing salary directly, of what the range is for that position and where you fall within the salary band or the salary range. The other thing I'd point out is that, well, and most of the time, pay transparency is something we want. In certain contexts, it's something we don't want. And in California, they've banned the use of or consideration of prior salary at past employers in the decision, because what people found was that was perpetuating discrimination on the basis of gender and other topics, because if prior jobs paid you less, then obviously future jobs and current employers, maybe ones that are not trying to do this, are using past discrimination to perpetuate the current pay gap. So in California, employers are not allowed to ask you what you made at a past job or to use that in their decision as what you're going to make in this job.
Thank you. So another factor that I know that we want to discuss tonight is that for employees who are working to assess whether or not they're being paid equal to their peers, another common question that may come up is, how similar does my job need to be to the job of the person I'm comparing myself with?
So that breaks down in a couple different ways. Mostly what we're talking about tonight is equal pay laws, and those laws do not require you to demonstrate an intent, right? You don't have to prove that your employer intentionally is discriminating against you because of your gender, for example. It's a comparison of jobs, and for those laws, the job has to be pretty similar. Again, it varies by state. In California, it doesn't need to be an identical job. It just needs to be a job that is substantially similar to the work of another person. And it doesn't have to be the same establishment as the other person you're comparing yourself to. Under federal law, it's a little bit more narrow. But like I said, I would encourage you to look at your state law because it's often more expansive in that respect. Separately, there are pay discrimination laws, and it's obviously illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender or other categories, both in terms of promotions and things, but also in terms of just compensation. So in that context, if you have other evidence that discriminatory intent is involved, then the jobs you're comparing yourself to probably do not need to be as identical.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this great amount of information and giving our alums these tools to at least start the assessment. Elaine, of your many areas, we're switching to Elaine. Of your many areas of expertise, one very deep area of expertise includes providing guidance on how to have difficult conversations. And at the very least, it seems that there is a general discomfort around discussing one's own experiences of bias or discrimination. When it comes to pay equity, as well as experiences of bias generally, many people are told to just speak up. Why doesn't that advice work?
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the question and to get to share this advice on the heels of what Siri, Pam, and Chaya have said. Just speak up doesn't work at advice because it denies reality. It denies the reality that people are uncomfortable talking about this, that whether explicitly or implicitly, we each have lifetimes worth of experiences and messages telling us don't speak up, whether it is about pay equity or whether it is about your preferences of what to have for dinner. Right? We have been conditioned over time to not speak up because, particularly for women and marginalized communities, your voice isn't valued. It also doesn't recognize the real role that gaslighting and retaliation play in keeping people silent. So a couple of big shifts. One is hearing Pam and Chaya speaking as lawyers saying, it's actually legal to talk about pay. Pay secrecy is illegal. That's a big assumption or understanding that needs to shift. And then the question becomes, how can we reduce the real and perceived risks of speaking up, and also equip people on how to speak up effectively and safely?
Excellent. That's a great lead into our next question, which we worked to set up, which is, what are safer and more effective ways to speak up, like ways that minimize the costs and maximize effectiveness?
There's so much that we can go into of what makes it more effective or can reduce some of those risks. I want to start with 3. The first would be do your homework. Like Chaya has mentioned, there's great resources of what data is out there to get as much information as you can. So strategy number 1 would be not only do your homework, but in conversation when you're speaking up, to share what you know and what you don't know. So what that does is several things. One is let the other person know, here's where I sit, here's what I've heard, these are the questions that it raises for me. And signaling of what you don't know is employers, to their credit or to their challenge, have a really difficult job to do. Pam, of course, has great advice on how to make this cheaper, simpler, mitigate risk. And so I would kick it to her to reiterate some of those strategies. But the reality is pay equity is and pay is a hard topic. So signaling what you know and what you're curious about sets you up for a conversation where you might learn something, and also puts you on the same side of the conversation rather than accusation, fix it, which sets us up for being more adversarial. Second strategy would be, can you anchor your conversation to an interest that matters to the other person? Whether it is HR that you're talking with, whether it is a mentor or a senior leader, what is something that they care about? So when you're raising pay equity, it's not just for pay equity, it's not just for self-interest, but it is because you care about equity generally. It is because you care about risk mitigation, like Pam said. Maybe it's that you care about retention and you want to keep your team intact, or maybe very practically, it's about cost savings, right? And so can you anchor the conversation to something that matters to the other person? This is fundamental negotiation. Everybody is asking, what's in it for me? Can you link your conversation to something that you already know matters to the other person? Third strategy would be balancing 2 key factors of negotiation, which is the substance, in this instance, pay equity, and the relationship, your level of trust and how the other person feels treated by you. One of the things that we see over and over is that a relationship trigger between the 2 parties actually undercuts the substance of the conversation. Because HR or because the senior leader, whoever you're having a conversation with, feels mistreated, disrespected by you, they get defensive. That's a natural human response. I wish it wasn't so, but it is the natural human response. And so if they get defensive, that means they shut down, that means they're not open to partnering with you. So what can you do? My favorite research around this is Roger Fisher and Dan Shapiro writing a book years ago called Beyond Reason, Using Emotions as You Negotiate. So can you pay attention to the core relational interests that each individual has? They call them core concerns. And really protect those as you're having conversations about difficult topics like pay equity. So they list 5, I'll add a 6th: autonomy, affiliation, appreciation, role, and status, and I'd add fairness. So are these core relational interests of the other person and of your own protected in the conversation? If so, you have a fundamentally greater likelihood of keeping the conversation on track rather than having it derail because the other person feels attacked or challenged.
Thank you so much. And there's also discussion on the relational interests, as well as a lot of the topics we're discussing tonight in your interview as well. And that's posted on the Pay Equity Task Force webpage. Actually, Elaine was our first interviewee, because speaking up effectively and safely is, of course, so very important. On that note, what do you do when you think you're walking into a safe space? You've done your homework, you've read Elaine's interview, you've, done all you can. But then when you're in that room, you realize it's not a safe space. What do you do from there?
Yeah, let me actually take us back to some of Siri's recommendations, which is if companies were proactively doing regular comprehensive audits, the onus wouldn't be on individual people, individual women, to raise these issues. The reality is that that's not currently happening. And so it is up to each of us to negotiate, to speak up. And of course, it comes with some of those risks. If you realize that the space is not safe for whatever reason, that could be the other person appears to be defensive. It could be because you don't feel psychologically safe in that moment and you're worried about retaliation or your career, et cetera, 2 key moves. My go-to move in that moment is actually listen. So you shift from advocacy of figuring out what I have to say, how I have to prove myself, what to do, to either asking a question like, tell me how you see it, or just staying silent. In mediation, we have this, this norm of do no harm. And so if you're in a moment where it doesn't feel safe, staying silent, doing no harm does several things. Number 1, it buys you time. Number 2, listening means that you have a fundamental opportunity to gather information. And that information is what you can figure out what to do with later. But in that moment, shifting into that mode of listening allows you to gather information and buy yourself some time. The second move that I would do if you realize that it doesn't feel safe is to thank the other person, which feels really counterintuitive. To appreciate them when you feel attacked and don't feel safe is one of the last things we want to do. But going back to relational interest actually preserves the relationship or increases the likelihood that you can, which is to say, thanks so much for your time. You've given me a lot to think about. And the other move that I would want to inject there is setting up a process for continuing the conversation. So just because you haven't figured out what you want to do with it, or maybe you need to do more research, maybe you need to consult Chaya, doesn't mean that the conversation is over. So move number 1, if it doesn't feel safe, is listen. Move number 2 is thank the other person and signal to them that the conversation will continue. Again, that can sound like, thanks so much for your time. Let me process, think about this, and I'll circle back to you next week or next month to continue the conversation.
Elaine, thank you so much. This is very great advice, and it's so very important for our alums and our alumni considering how and whether to speak up. Thank you so much. Chaya, sometimes asking questions about pay equity or discussing experiences of bias generally may trigger adverse responses from an alum's employer, some of which Elaine has just gone over, either retaliation or adverse working conditions, or maybe even legal documents that an alum is asked to sign. It's often difficult for employees to know if and when to seek out counsel. As such, many alums may ask, at what point should I talk to a lawyer?
So I think that the quick answer to that is, as soon as you think there's a problem or think you might need help, that doesn't mean that you have to engage a lawyer, but a couple things you should know. First, as soon as you contact an attorney seeking legal advice or services, it's an attorney-client privilege communication. So even if you don't end up engaging the attorney or work or going forward with it, you can feel comfortable that it's a protected and confidential conversation. The other thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes attorneys, in fact, I would say most of the time, provide a certain amount of initial conversation for free. That's certainly my practice. And that's to help kind of get an idea if this is a good fit and if there's something that you need to engage an attorney on now, or whether you kind of have what you need to get an understanding of the landscape and you can keep it in mind for the future. So you shouldn't feel either that by reaching out to attorneys, you're committing to a certain path, or that you're committing to pay or sacrificing any confidentiality in the process. In terms of whether or not you engage further, I think, one question I often ask potential clients is, how do you hope this plays out? If you could choose it, if you could wave a magic wand, how would it play out? And the answer is varied. For some people, they say, I've been mistreated too much and I don't really want to be there. And so then it's a conversation about how to sort of separate in a way that's most advantageous for them. Other people want to stay there and they want to continue those relationships, but they want to get over this hurdle that they've been confronted with, and then a different set of strategies is employed. So I would just say early and often, knowing that there's upside and there's not downside. You don't have to choose a path just because you've contacted attorneys to get initial advice.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That is, I think, covering a lot of information that non-lawyers just aren't aware of. And so that is really great to hear. Thank you. All right. So thank you again, panelists, for helping to give a thorough review of the current state of pay inequity, as well as some important factors to consider in this area. Now that we have mapped out various parameters of pay inequity and of experiences of bias generally, we've come to the portion of the evening where we will start discussing solutions. So Chaya and Pam, with your government legislative background, in your view, I'll start with Chaya. In your view, what is the potential legislative fix that would most advance the Me Too movement and the pay equity movements? Chaya.
So to me, the most pernicious legal impediment to progress in this is forced arbitration. Many of you are probably bound by such agreements right now, many in the audience. But essentially, forced arbitration means that the right to have disputes involving discrimination or pay in public forums is taken away from the employee out of the gate because they can't get the job unless they agree to do that. The other key issue that arbitration implicates are these class action waivers. So a lot of disputes are logistically infeasible to bring other than collectively. So for example, if you realize that you're underpaid relative to a perfect comparator male by $3,000, that's a lot of money, something you'd want to address. Having said that, it's not enough money for it to make sense either for you to pay an attorney by the hour or for an attorney to be able to handle it on a contingency fee basis. So by forcing employees to sign away their rights to pursue things collectively, essentially it renders a certain subset of cases unbringable by the private sector. Having said that, I'd still encourage you in small amounts to reach out both to private attorneys and to government enforcement agencies that don't have those same financial constraints, like the California Department of Labor, the US Wage and Hour Division, the EEOC. But for me, forced arbitration really is a huge roadblock both for pay equality and the Me Too movement. And it's essentially by putting words in a magic document that you've titled arbitration agreement, you're allowed to get away with a lot of waiving of people's rights that you wouldn't be able to in other contexts. So to solve that problem, there's really two routes. The most viable, I'd say at this point, is by a federal legislation to fix the Federal Arbitration Act, which is what the Supreme Court has used to sort of bless this process of forced arbitration. So I think a legislative fix would be if a different Congress, frankly, or a different Senate at this point, and President were to move through a bill that's been introduced a lot by the lower house, the Congress recently, to fix the arbitration. This could also come from a different Supreme Court. They have been interpreting the Federal Arbitration Act in a way that has allowed these to go forward. Short of those types of legal and legislative fixes, peer pressure has gone a long way. So some of you may recall in the wake of the Me Too movement, certain big tech employers, employees got together, and actually law firms too, law students got together and said, look, we're not going to come work for you if you're going to mandate that we waive our right to pursue claims in court. And it was effective in certain contexts. So short of those two, I think there is some amount of just collective action that employees or students can do until one of those fixes happens.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That is very thorough, and hopefully that gets moved forward. Pam, do you have thoughts as well on this?
Okay, I had to unmute myself. So I endorse everything Chaya said about forced arbitration. And we talked earlier about accountability, right? And making organizations more responsive to fix these problems, right? And so that is yet another way that we're removing that accountability. A couple other things to think about. I see we have a question in the chat about intersectionality, right? And that, and we've already talked, and Siri gave us some great information about how race can compound the gender wage gap for women of color. And we know that for men of color, there is a wage gap as well. And so California actually amended its equal pay legislation to provide more protections for individuals based on race and ethnicity who are experiencing wage gaps. There's some federal, a bill that's been put forward in Congress to be able to do that, but that is a place where there is not enough protection because, as was mentioned earlier, under the Equal Pay Act and state equal pay acts, if you have a gender-based pay difference, you don't have to show intent and you meet all the requirements. And so that would be an important area for both state and federal law. We have great innovations in state law that have been happening over the past 5, 6, 7 years while the Paycheck Fairness Act is stalled in Congress. That's some important fixes to the Equal Pay Act. States have moved ahead. California has expanded protections as well by making it easier to compare people for pay claims. You have states like New York and other places that have strengthened their pay equity laws. Folks are looking at this issue about whether you can keep companies from relying on your prior salary in the market. That creates several problems, right? So one is if we have, existing discrimination in the labor market, then women are automatically disfavored by this process. But it's also the case that it really messes everything up, right? If you have a set amount that you're thinking about, have budgeted for this job, and it's probably based on what you're already paying the people who are in your organization, right? That if you just blindly match somebody else's salary without thinking about what that means overall and whether it makes sense and promotes equity, you can essentially create a problem for yourself in that hire. Whereas if you look at what is the job, what does this candidate bring to it, how do I measure and evaluate it, what's a fair salary, you're really gonna be much better off. And then the last thing is this transparency, both trying to, again, reduce pay secrecy and looking at, people are talking about reforms like requiring posting of salaries on when you post jobs, or making it easier for employees to get those salary bands and understand where they stand. So those are all important areas for legislation.
Thank you. That is very thorough and helpful. Okay, so now we have time for a lightning round, after which we will start to try to answer some questions and answers. But for the lightning round, we are giving each of our panelists 1 minute, and they've prepared for this. And they will address the question, what is something that companies can do immediately to help advance pay equity and or eliminate bias? And the answers are, by design, going to be 1 or 2 minutes that they are digestible. So starting out, just by the way that we worked through panelists throughout the evening, if that sounds like a good order. Siri, can we start with you, followed by Pam, Chaya, and Elaine? Does that work?
Sounds good. I'm going to emphasize and underscore an idea that's come across and come up already multiple times this evening, and that's proactive pay audits on behalf of companies. It really is high time that we put the onus, shift the onus from individual employees to the employers, to the organizations, the companies that are making decisions about compensation, to ensure that those decisions are fair and unbiased. And so to this end, companies should conduct annual, or even more frequent than that, perhaps biannual, pay audits where they look across the company at all employees and ensure that there are no undue gaps in compensation by gender or race. And this should include, Chaya alluded to this earlier, this should include not just people's base salary, but all aspects of compensation. So stock grants, equity grants, bonuses, discretionary manager awards, any type of compensation should be included in that analysis. And the reason it should be conducted so frequently is because a lot of companies in the real world, including Intel, which has been public about their experience, tend to see that even once pay gaps are closed, unless you keep a watchful eye, they can reemerge again. And so that's why the constant vigilance and frequent running of these audits is so important.
Thank you so much. Pam, can we go to you next?
Sure. So my main recommendation is to change your mindset, to put equity first, right? And that means make equity the priority when you're making your decisions or taking actions, designing your programs, even when you're doing the measurement that Siri is talking about. So there are three ways that you can think about this in a practical way. The first is remove the barriers. So this is that due diligence I talked about. Go looking for the places where equity gets out of balance. You know, one is these offers at hire. Maybe you're overvaluing new talent versus the people who've already in your organization. Maybe you're not really looking at objective, measurable, and unbiased factors when you're setting pay. The second one is to change your norms, right? So moving away from justifying or excusing differences and start with the principle that you pay people the same for the same kind of work, the same kind of experience, the same level of responsibility, and that you hold people accountable for making fair decisions. That's part of the norm and culture of your organization. And the third is to embrace transparency, right? So secrecy can't protect you. This is a world where transparency is a legal right and a cultural reality for large parts of your workforce. So when you are doing that self-analysis and when you are examining your practices and removing barriers, start with the assumption that everything is going to be public. If it doesn't measure up in public, then you need to take action. And you need to share your progress because that's how you build trust in the workplace and the marketplace. So put equity first because it's the right thing to do. It's the law, but it can also make your pay program better, cheaper, and more efficient. It can drive innovation. It can give you a competitive advantage when hiring, retaining, and supporting a really diverse workforce. And it's part of being leadership.
Completely agree. Thank you so much. Chaya, can we go to you next?
Sure. I guess my main advice to employers would be to go back and watch the answers that Siri and Pam just gave, because I think they hit the nail on the head on what to do about this. The idea of changing your mindset makes me think about, there's a whole host of social science research, both in this context and in the harassment context, that it really does start at the top with a culture that genuinely wants to do the right thing on these issues, even more so than any type of training or stick and carrot approach. It really has to come from leadership that makes this a priority. So to start thinking of these things as metrics to hit and genuine goals to achieve alongside revenue and product development and the other things that businesses traditionally think of as the markers of success.
Thank you. Excellent. And we actually have an interview with Siri actually coming up that will be posted probably next week on the Pay Equity Task Force website as well. So in addition to listening to Siri's responses, you'll be able to read Siri's responses as well. Wonderful. So Aline, I wanted to touch base. I know that we have time, I think. I know that you have two answers. Like we had two questions kind of in the ether for this one, and you answered both of them. Would you like to answer just one of them or both of them? We have time for both.
Sure. So, I mean, my first answer on what can companies do immediately to impact pay equity is do what Siri, Pam, and Chaya said. We're in violent agreement with each other. So objective criteria, transparency, regular comprehensive audits, that all needs to be on, the burden needs to be on the employer for all the reasons that Pam mentioned, right? Innovation, cheaper, faster, better. Let's stop all the angst for employers, for managers, the amount of time that employers spend on negotiating what the range is, how to measure it. If all of that is objective, it just makes it simpler. And I would challenge us to really review what we think is objective criteria. So leading strategically is not actually objective. Leading strategically is up to the perception of people in power to decide whether the individual is leading strategically versus bring in $400,000 of revenue, right? Not everything is as measurable or as easy to measure, but to challenge ourselves to really look at, is this objective criteria or not? The second is actually your second question, Kristen. What can companies do to immediately make an impact on managing bias? And that goes to one of the questions in the Q&A of, can companies recognize the value of traditional feminine leadership styles or the perceived value of impact that women can make on an organization? Happy to talk about that at length. And I would say it actually starts with what Chaya was saying, senior leadership. If you are in a position of power, do you have not only the mindset, but the skill set to hear perspectives that are different than your own? And that challenges the status quo. That can be deeply uncomfortable at times, but is necessary for innovation, progress, growth, any of the things that we might aspire to. If you don't have senior leadership that fundamentally has curiosity and openness to hear a different perspective, to ask any employee, male or female, to speak up is setting them up not for success. And so it's going to take a shift that for me is a fundamental skill set of, can we hear perspectives that are different than our own?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Speaking of Q&As, you're really good at segues, Elaine. It's amazing. We have a number of them that have already been submitted, and according to Moana, who has been helping to facilitate this and has done an excellent job, there is a way to up-level questions based on their popularity. And so I just do want to note and remark that we have two panelists who have a hard stop at 6. And so perhaps it'd be good for Elaine and Chaya, do you have any other thoughts before we go to Q&A? And you have to step away?
Nope, bring them on.
Bring them on. Okay. So what are your thoughts? This can be answered by everyone. What are your thoughts on removing negotiation altogether and having salaries preset as a way to eliminate the pay gap?
If you don't mind, I'm going to jump in on this because this is actually something that I actively do in my consulting practice. And I think this is something Elaine was alluding to, which is, it is really possible to have a process where things are more defined. And we know that workplaces like the federal government or workplaces that have adopted more of a explicit pay scale tend to have less of an equity gap. And even, this is something that you see some tech firms do where we say, these are the factors, like it's a calculation. What's your location, what's your function, what's your level, how much experience do you have? These are really objective and measurable, and it's so much easier on the hiring managers. It's easier on the candidates too, right? Because you can really just have a conversation about what's going to matter and get to a fair salary that way. So I am very much in favor of that. And I also say that if you want to have negotiation because you're really worried about getting out of sync with the market, that's fine. But anytime you go outside that preset amount with one person, you have to look back at everyone else who's in the organization to see what adjustments you want to make. And knowing that you have to do that is a really good way of making sure that you're only doing that when it's really the right thing to do.
I would add to what Pam said, the best approach that evidence would suggest goes the longest way toward closing the pay gap would indeed be eliminating negotiation. But if that's not possible, we have an excellent randomized controlled study that shows that when you make it explicit that a salary is negotiable on the job description, that not only helps to close the pay gap among the people that are hired, but that statement actually also encouraged more underrepresented groups to apply for the job. So if you're going to have a component of negotiation, be very explicit about it, the fact that it exists, and which aspects of the job are negotiable. Maybe only salary is negotiable. Maybe salary, location, and part-time, full-time status are negotiable. Being very explicit and structured about all of those components helps on various fronts.
I would piggyback on that to say, if you are wondering about whether to negotiate, what is your own hook, right? Why would you put yourself through this? Because it can feel fraught and you can doubt yourself, and linking to any of those interests we talked about earlier, equity, fair compensation, adjusted or unadjusted income over time that Siri talked about in terms of calculation. Again, we have been told so many times that we shouldn't negotiate. We don't want to put the job offer at risk. So the other thing that I would ask employers to do is something that Pam mentioned earlier of, can we be transparent about what factors are at play here? What are the things that are going to be rewarded in a negotiation or at this organization that you can then also anchor to?
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we have another question in the Q&A. I think that everyone has access to it, but I'll read it out for the group. I never knew there was such a thing as pay transparency. Thank you. What is your advice for individual companies at large institutions who are trying to evaluate pay equity for themselves, where there are huge salary bands / ranges in places for positions?
Well, I mean, it's a hard one. It's a good question. I think, as we talked about earlier, the first thing you can do is have conversations with your peers and commit to being transparent with your peers. And if you start seeing a problem, it may be a bigger problem, and that may be a good time to talk to an attorney. Obviously, you know, as you pursue a legal process, even if it doesn't involve a lawsuit, it may just involve a letter. You can kind of put the onus on the company. You can say, well, look, from the information we have, we're reaching a certain conclusion. And if you want us to reach a different conclusion before you get sued and before there's discovery, you can share with us a reason why we don't have it right in terms of the data. So sometimes talking to coworkers is the first step to getting a more expansive disclosure from an employer if they're not willing to give it to you through kind of informal channels.
It's worth calling out what Chaya mentioned earlier, which is that actually approaching an attorney does not mean engaging them. I feel like there is this burden to even engaging attorney, right? How do you find that? We're all so busy. The last thing I have to do is find time for this. And what I hear from you, Chaya, is really, can I consult someone who has other information on this issue so that I can make better informed decisions?
Exactly. Oftentimes it's as simple as getting educated on the landscape and options available to you, and you're armed with the tools you need to navigate it by yourself. And other times it may be a perfect fit, and you have the knowing that you have that support in the background emboldens you to take the steps you need to take.
Excellent, thank you so much. All right, so we do want to continue with question and answer for as long as we have. Why don't we take a moment just to have closing remarks in case some of our audience has to leave at this time. And so I'll pass the baton to Mary Jane and Deborah, and then we'll circle back to the audience.
Thank you, Kristen, and thanks so much to our panelists. Thank you to all of you who attended. This is such an important topic, as we all know, and I want to assure you that AMITA Pay Equity Task Force will continue to have resources. We'll build a set of resources on our website, as will the MIT Equal Pay Working Group. So, Deborah?
I just want to add, if you are a student or postdoc in the audience, to please reach out to our office, Career Advising and Professional Development, for any additional resources on pay equity, but also how to negotiate offers. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful, excellent. All right, shall we continue with Q&As? Actually, is there a way for us to get the audience more involved, or no? No? Okay. So, so Pam, you mentioned this one earlier. How is the wage gap affected by the intersectionality of race and gender?
Well, so intersectionality, right, as a concept that was originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, but really is about how different types of bias and discrimination can interact, right? So race and gender is a very significant one, but gender and disability, race and sexual orientation. So lots of identities that folks have are intersectional and multifaceted. And so it means that you can be impacted in more than one way by inequality. And so it's really important, as I mentioned, to make sure that our laws are really equipped to fully protect everyone on all aspects of their identity. That the wage gap, as Siri mentioned, is definitely more significant for women of color than for white women. And that when you're doing your analysis, you want to make that explicit and part of your analysis and understanding what's happening.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm just running through the questions that we all have access to. So how have places like Indeed transformed salary information exchange and negotiation?
I'll start, which is you have a little bit more information. And I'll say a little bit because there's some there and we're still doing comparisons and resolving for different factors, but I would use all that information. When we are hiring, I'm always looking for a well-prepared individual who has thought this through and can make their case, because I, as any one individual, may not have all the information. So can we take that data and use it in the conversation as data? Meaning, my first advice on how to raise things safely was, can you share what you know and also what you don't know? So I'm looking at Indeed, I'm looking at the city, I'm looking at this role. To me, it looks comparable. And so I'm being paid $10,000 less right now than what I'm seeing on Indeed. And that's a piece of data that goes into the conversation, including employer, how are you thinking about it? What might I be missing here that I don't have transparency to? Could you educate me? So I'd absolutely use that information as data in your negotiation because it's a data point.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any comments on this one? Thank you so much, Elaine. As mentioned by the panelists, employers may not actually be rewarding what they think they value. For women, often the underlying qualities valued by the organization, Elaine, you talked about this one a little bit, the qualities valued by the organization are tremendously biased towards a male-dominated environment due to the organization's history, such as well-established engineering industry companies. How can women make a case for their perceived value in this organization, this type of organization, with the intent of getting pay equity? For example, men making short-sighted decisions that may seem high risk, high payoff, and really cool versus women with more sustainable, less risky solutions, etc. Elaine, would you like to start?
Yeah, there is so much richness in this, and thank you, Catherine, for raising it. One thought is, can we anchor what women traditionally bring, and I'll use that term broadly, to the interests of the organization? What could we gain if we were more inclusive, more collaborative, if we weren't so short-sighted in decision making? And are those things that the company can value? There's a good amount of research that you don't actually reap the benefits of diversity unless you also have psychological safety, which brings me to my second point. Again, can we have the skill set to listen, be genuinely curious, open to perspectives, others different than our own? If we don't have that, we're not going to value what women bring, and also aren't going to reap the benefits of those skill sets they do bring. What is unfortunate is I'm not speaking to women right now unless you're in power. And so we need the shift of people who are in power to actually value those things. If you are at a place as a business right now where you feel stuck, where you're not being as innovative as you think you could, it might be time to look at all of the other skills that women traditionally bring. Sierra, I see you nodding, so I might kick it to you there.
Thank you, Elaine. I would echo everything from your side in terms of what ultimately also needs to happen at the organizational level, right? Those changes in values and those broader definition of what is success, what is leadership, what are the qualities that we require in our successful people in this organization. Ultimately, those need to get reflected in things like performance evaluation criteria, promotion criteria. They need to be reflected in the criteria that get people selected for high potential programs and leadership development programs. From the individual side, if you are an employee in this type of organization and you're not in a position to change all of that institutional structure around you, as a short-term piece of advice, I would suggest trying to frame your accomplishments and your results in terms that the organization values. So if this is a place where it's all about demonstrating your value in dollars, how can you express the results of your work and what you've done and the success of it in dollar terms? Or if instead it's all about networks and this organization values people who have broad-based relationships, who can work cross-functionally, how can you describe your value in those terms? And how to understand that? Well, try to talk to as many people in the organization as you can and understand how they've gotten to where they are, and what they feel is valued by the organization, what they personally value as managers, to get that information about how do I frame my accomplishments.
Excellent responses. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this is so great to have everyone gathered. All right, the next question that we have is related to at-will employment and whether or not that encourages employees not to self-advocate, or whether that impacts fear of retaliation.
So I can take this one. First of all, it shouldn't. You should be very aware that retaliation in this context is illegal, even if you're an at-will employee. Employers cannot retaliate against you for making inquiries about your pay relative to others, sharing your pay with coworkers, or raising concerns about discrimination or unequal pay. So even if you're an at-will employee, it's illegal. But while we're talking about at-will employment more generally, I figure it would be good for the audience to know, I always encourage employees, particularly if you have the negotiating leverage at the front end, build in contractual protections to at-will employment. You will always be, by and large, in the private sector at least, an at-will employee, but that does not mean that there can't be contractual ramifications for a company letting you go without cause. So a typical provision looks along the lines of, yes, 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 blah, 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 I'm at will, you can let me go whenever you want, but if you let me go for a reason that doesn't amount to cause, I'm owed something contractually. It could be a year of severance pay. It could be acceleration of your equity. So what you want to build in is some mitigation to the ramifications of at-will employment, which is, yeah, you can do what you want. You have the flexibility to do that. But if I'm doing my job and for other reasons, you let me go, or really even for reasons like about my job, but I didn't do anything really wrong, you owe me something. And that's a very important tool to mitigate the ramifications of at-will employment for employees, particularly when equity is involved, because oftentimes equity has a one-year cliff before any of it vests, and employees go to a job where the principal form of compensation they're going to get is equity. Sometimes they take a huge salary reduction to get that job, and then at month 11, they're fired. And the sad part is, unless they have a term along these lines or the motivation to terminate them was something independently unlawful, they've lost out on all that equity. So very, very important to try to acknowledge the at-will status at the front end and build some contractual protections.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Chaya. I was hoping you'd answer that one. We are getting close to the end right now. So one more question, if that sounds good. Is there a legal right to ask for gender audit in my company? And perhaps at least getting input from Chaya and Pam on this, and of course, Elaine and Siri, if you'd like as well.
There's not a legal right to compel them in most cases. You certainly can ask for it. And again, that would be protected activity for purposes of retaliation claim. But most employers are not legally mandated to provide information to you beyond your particular pay or to do a pay audit of that nature.
There is one context that I know of where companies are actually required to do a pay audit, although they're not required to tell you the results or, you know, it's because if you are a contractor with the federal government, if you have a contract of at least $50,000 and it's a company with at least 50 employees, you're subject to affirmative action plan requirements. And one of them is that your affirmative action plan includes a self-analysis of compensation based on race and gender, that you have to look at it, you have to evaluate whether it shows that there are barriers or impediments to equity, and you have to address it. So if your company is a federal contractor, they are under those obligations to at least do that work and act on it, as well as other affirmative action plan requirements. And you can file a complaint with the Department of Labor or CCP under certain circumstances as well with your individual compensation issues.
Excellent, thank you so much. So that is the end of the question and answer session. So I'll be passing it back to Mary Jane and Deborah to close us out. Thank you so much, panelists.
I think I'd just like to thank everyone again. This has been a really amazing conversation. I would urge our attendees to check out the interviews on the AMITA Pay Equity Task Force website with Elaine, Pamela, and Siri, and to keep an eye out for additional resources as we move forward. I'd also like to give a heartfelt thanks to the MIT Alumni Association for making all this happen, particularly in the person of Moana Benton, whom I'm sure has superpowers that are enabling her to support us all so effectively, particularly during Alumni Leadership Conference Week. Deborah?
Just to note, to say thank you to all of our panelists for staying later and answering the questions, and to everyone who chose to join us tonight. We're happy to bring this workshop to you and hope to bring many more throughout the year. So, good night.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.